Los Angeles, December 1995. The silence outside the church doesn't feel like mourning. It feels heavier, compressed, intentional. Everyone who was meant to be here has arrived, and one man has not. Inside, no one speaks his name out loud, yet eyes keep drifting to the same empty space. Journalists aren't whispering about death, they're counting absence, measuring it, trying to understand how a single missing figure can outweigh the entire room. He didn't come. Frank Sinatra, the closest friend, the man everyone expected to stand in the front row. There are no statements, no denials, no last-minute excuses leaked to the press. And that is what unsettles people most. Because this isn't scandal, it's restraint. Somewhere in this room are people who know exactly why he isn't here. And somewhere, buried deeper than any headline, is the knowledge that one man asked for something so final, so personal, that it could only be honored through silence. Not anger, not distance, absence. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. The church sat low against the gray California morning, its stone darkened by cold air that smelled faintly of wet flowers and old varnish. Nothing about the place suggested spectacle. No barricades, no shouting fans, just a narrow driveway, a handful of parked sedans, and men in dark coats standing a little too far apart from one another, as if closeness might invite conversation. Inside, the room was already full, yet something felt unfinished. The casket was closed. Simple. No dramatic lighting, no orchestral swell waiting in the wings. This was not a farewell designed for photographs. The guest list had been cut with care. Family, a few longtime friends, several musicians whose names no longer meant much to the newspapers, but meant everything to each other. People who had learned, decades earlier, when not to speak. The silence had weight, shoes brushed softly against the floor, leather soles whispering instead of clicking. Somewhere near the back, a man coughed once and stopped himself immediately, embarrassed by the sound of his own body. The air was cool enough that hands stayed clasped, not in prayer, but for warmth. In the first row, one seat remained empty. No card, no name, nothing to draw attention to it, and yet eyes kept drifting there, then away, then back again. It was the kind of absence that rearranged the room around it. No one pointed. No one asked. But everyone knew which presence was missing, and everyone knew better than to say it out loud. Outside, near the side entrance, a man with thinning gray hair lit a cigarette with shaking fingers, cupping the flame from the wind. He took one drag, then another, staring at nothing. A woman nearby adjusted her sunglasses, even though the sky offered no brightness. A pair of elderly musicians exchanged a brief nod. No words, no expression. Understanding passed between them like a private signal. This was not grief looking for comfort. This was restraint. A journalist stood near the far wall, notebook untouched. He leaned toward a colleague and lowered his voice to a whisper that barely carried over the hum of the heating vents. "He didn't come," he said. Not a question, a confirmation. But he knew this was today. The colleague's pen paused. That was the part that unsettled him, because it was already known, quietly, carefully, that Frank Sinatra had been in the city. No illness reported, no emergency flight, no statement released through a publicist or a lawyer. Nothing to explain what the empty seat refused to say. At the front, the priest spoke gently, choosing words that did not reach for drama. Names were mentioned, achievements acknowledged. But even here, in this controlled stillness, there was an unspoken adjustment being made. Certain anecdotes were left out. Certain laughter was avoided. It was as if the room itself had agreed not to tip into nostalgia. This was a burial, not a legend being polished. When the name Dean Martin was spoken, heads bowed, not in performance, but in habit. Many of these people had buried friends before. Too many, perhaps. They had seen how death could be hijacked by cameras, by rivalries, by unfinished narratives. This ceremony refused all of that. And still, the empty seat pressed in. No one framed it as scandal. No one whispered about feuds. What lingered instead was something colder, sharper. If death itself had not pulled him through those doors, then whatever kept him away had to be stronger than pride, stronger than history, stronger even than grief. That thought settled quietly among the rows, as heavy as the winter air. When the service ended, there was no rush. People rose slowly, coats pulled tighter, conversations postponed. The chair in the front row remained untouched until the very last moment, when an usher finally stepped forward and folded it away. Careful, almost respectful. And for those who noticed, that small, practical gesture felt louder than any eulogy. The silence did not ask to be explained. It asked to be remembered. By the time the legend solidified, the truth had already slipped away. In the popular telling, the two men stood side by side as equals, laughing, drinking, trading lines under hot lights while the audience watched a friendship unfold in real time. But those who worked the rooms before the myth hardened knew better. What existed between Dean Martin and Frank Sinatra was never simple camaraderie. It was a balance negotiated nightly, sometimes hourly, through looks, pauses, and things deliberately left unsaid. Backstage in the 1950s and early 60s, the air was thick with smoke and anticipation. Bottles were opened more often than contracts. Jokes flew fast, sharp enough to draw blood if taken seriously. But no one ever did. That was the rule. On stage, the chaos looked effortless. Off stage, it required precision. Frank entered rooms like weather, loud, shifting, impossible to ignore. He fed on reaction, on loyalty, on the constant need to feel the current running through him. Dean moved differently. He arrived already settled, already finished with the argument before it began. Where Frank pushed, Dean waited. Where Frank demanded, Dean allowed, or didn't. There was an unspoken understanding about power, and it rarely favored the man history later crowned. In private circles, producers, club owners, musicians who had seen careers rise and evaporate, it was often said that Dean was the steadier force, not the louder one, not the angrier one, the one who could end a conversation by leaning back and saying nothing at all. That silence made people nervous. The first crack in the legend came quietly. During a period when Frank's contracts tightened and his public image grew volatile, doors that once opened easily began to stall. He noticed who stopped calling. He noticed who still answered. Dean never announced his support. He never stood beside Frank at a microphone to defend him. Instead, problems dissolved without explanation. A venue reappeared. A booking smoothed over. A producer changed his tone overnight. No credit was taken. None was offered. It was understood that Dean handled things away from light, where favors could be paid without applause. Even Frank, for all his volatility, recognized that kind of protection when it mattered. He never thanked Dean directly. Gratitude would have broken the balance. Instead, he grew louder, more generous in public, as if volume itself could repay a debt. Dean never corrected him. On stage, the jokes continued. The drinks kept flowing. The audience believed they were watching men who feared nothing. What they didn't see were the moments after the curtain fell. Frank pacing, talking too fast, while Dean sat still, eyes half-lidded, listening, not agreeing, not comforting, simply present. And when people tried to defend Dean publicly, journalists, fans, even friends, he shut it down without discussion. No interviews, no clarifications. If Frank needed space to be the storm, Dean would be the structure that didn't move. That choice wasn't kindness. It was control. Those who knew them well understood this much. If something ever broke between them, it wouldn't be over ego or applause. It would be because one of them finally asked for something the other could not, or should not, give. And if that moment came, it would happen far from the stage, where no one was watching, and no legend could soften what was said. By the early 1980s, the disappearance happened slowly enough that most people mistook it for choice. Shows were declined without explanation. Calls went unanswered not out of spite, but out of exhaustion. Dean Martin did not announce a retreat. He simply reduced his presence until it became noticeable only in hindsight. Those who expected a comeback kept waiting. Those who knew better stopped asking. Then came 1987. The news traveled fast, but its impact did not. The death of his son did not arrive as a dramatic rupture. It hollowed him out quietly, methodically. People close to Dean later struggled to describe the change because nothing obvious shifted. His voice remained calm. His manners stayed intact. What vanished was his tolerance for anything unnecessary. Phones rang and rang. Invitations stacked up unopened. Even old alliances, some decades in the making, were allowed to loosen, then fall away. That included Frank Sinatra. There was no argument, no public rift, just absence. Months passed before they met again, and when they did, it wasn't arranged through managers or assistants. No restaurant, no club, no audience by accident or design. Just two men in a quiet room, sitting farther apart than they ever had before. No alcohol was poured. That detail mattered. Frank spoke first, filling the space out of habit, circling the subject without touching it. Dean listened, hands folded, eyes fixed somewhere between Frank's shoulder and the wall behind him. When he finally spoke, it wasn't to respond. It was to redirect. What he asked for landed heavily, not because it was emotional, but because it was precise. Frank reacted immediately, not angrily, instinctively. He dismissed it, waved it away, treated it like a dark joke that didn't deserve daylight. He reminded Dean of history, of loyalty, of what the world expected of them. His voice rose, then steadied, then rose again. Dean did not interrupt. When Frank finished, Dean answered with a tone so level it felt rehearsed, though it clearly wasn't. He didn't accuse. He didn't explain himself. He framed the request not as a demand, but as something that could only be honored once, and only by one person. There was no negotiation after that. Frank understood the finality immediately, and it unsettled him more than anger would have. He tried to reshape the conversation, to find a softer version of what had just been said. Dean didn't stop him. He let him exhaust the effort. At the end, Dean stood first. No handshake followed. No promise was extracted. But something had shifted irrevocably. What remained between them was no longer an active bond. It was an obligation, sealed by restraint rather than affection. They did not speak often after that. When they did, it was practical, polite, carefully limited. Whatever had been asked was never mentioned again, but it lingered in the spaces where familiarity used to live. Long before the funeral, the terms had already been set. And long before the silence became visible, one man had accepted that honoring it would cost him everything the public expected. And more. By the end of the decade, solitude was no longer a phase. It was design. Dean Martin lived quietly, but not passively. His days followed a rhythm that excluded chance encounters and unnecessary witnesses. Curtains stayed drawn longer. Invitations were declined with the same calm phrasing every time: polite, final, unnegotiable. He didn't disappear out of sadness. He disappeared out of intention. Those who did see him noticed the change immediately. The familiar ease was still there, but stripped of performance. No practiced charm. No reflexive humor. He spoke when there was something worth saying, and stopped when there wasn't. The image the world loved, the relaxed drink in hand, the half-smile that suggested nothing mattered, was being dismantled carefully, piece by piece. It wasn't bitterness. It was preparation. He refused several private events where old friends were expected to gather. The reasoning was never dramatic. He would tilt his head slightly and say he didn't want to be remembered like this, leaving the sentence unfinished. No one pushed. The clarity in his voice made questions feel intrusive. What unsettled people was how methodical he became. Without involving family drama or legal spectacle, Dean began attending to details others avoided. Arrangements were reviewed, lists shortened, instructions refined. This wasn't the behavior of a man afraid of dying. It was the behavior of someone who had seen too many endings ruined by excess. He had attended enough funerals to know how easily grief could be hijacked, how a single famous face could redraw the focus of an entire room. He wanted none of that. Not for himself. Not for anyone else. When asked, carefully, why he insisted on such control, his answer was simple. He didn't want his death to become a gathering point for unresolved narratives. He wanted it clean, contained, finite. There was no self-pity in this logic, no regret voiced. If anything, there was relief in the precision. He had spent a lifetime improvising for others. This was the one moment he would not leave open to interpretation. Names were written down, not many. Some surprised people by their absence. One absence, in particular, was unmistakable. No explanation followed. None was offered privately, either. Those closest to him understood that asking would only confirm what they already suspected. This was not about conflict. It was about consequence. Dean spoke of the end the way an architect might speak of demolition. Necessary, deliberate, unromantic. He didn't want applause. He didn't want redemption arcs. He wanted silence where silence belonged. And in that silence, there was an unspoken acknowledgement of someone else. Someone whose presence could undo everything he was trying to preserve. By the time his health began to fail, the decisions were already locked in place. No revisions, no emotional addendums. What he wanted was not secrecy, but restraint. Those who sensed it felt uneasy, though they couldn't articulate why. For the first time, it became possible to imagine that the most meaningful absence at his funeral would not be accidental. It would be enforced. The days leading up to the funeral unfolded with brutal clarity for Frank Sinatra. There was no confusion about logistics. He knew the date. He knew the address. He knew the time doors would close and reopen. More importantly, he knew, better than anyone, that his absence would speak louder than his presence ever could. The suit was chosen early. Dark, conservative, familiar enough not to draw comment. Shoes polished the night before, not by an assistant, but by habit. The driver arrived on schedule. Nothing in the routine suggested hesitation. If anyone had been watching from the outside, it would have looked like preparation, not doubt. Yet memory has a way of interrupting intention. As the hour approached, Frank found himself returning, without warning, to that quiet room years earlier. No alcohol, no audience. The calm, deliberate tone in which Dean Martin had framed the request. At the time, it had sounded unreasonable, almost theatrical in its restraint. Now, stripped of context and proximity, it felt less like a conversation and more like instruction. Not emotional. Final. Frank had built a career on defiance, on refusing to do what was expected simply because it was expected. Cameras never frightened him. Headlines never softened his resolve. If he walked into that church, he knew exactly what would follow. Photographs, whispers, reframed narratives. The day would tilt toward him no matter how carefully he tried to disappear. And that was the problem. The car moved slowly through familiar streets. A bell tower came into view, then slipped behind a line of trees. Frank asked the driver to slow down. Not stop, just slow. He watched people entering in small groups, coats pulled tight, heads lowered. He recognized faces. Some glanced instinctively toward the street, as if sensing proximity. He stayed seated. Inside the car, sound arrived in fragments, the distant murmur of voices, the low toll of bells beginning their measured count. Frank did not bow his head. He didn't close his eyes. He sat upright, hands resting on his knees, breathing evenly, as if steady posture could anchor the choice he was making. This wasn't fear. It wasn't pride. It was obedience to something he disagreed with, but respected too deeply to ignore. When the bells paused, Frank gave a single nod. The driver didn't ask where to go. The car eased forward, then turned away before the service reached its midpoint. No last look. No delay to test resolve. The moment passed, the way Dean would have wanted it to, without spectacle. Later, people would speculate about motives. They would say he couldn't face it, that old wounds had never healed. Frank never corrected them, not publicly, not privately. Silence, in this case, was not avoidance. It was compliance. The pain lived not in what he missed, but in what he honored. And as the church doors closed behind him, unseen, unacknowledged, Frank accepted something he had spent his life resisting. That sometimes respect demands absence, and that the hardest loyalty is the one no one applauds. The request itself was never written down. That was deliberate. Years earlier, in that quiet room where nothing was poured and nothing was raised, not a glass, not a voice, Dean Martin had been precise about what he feared. Not death, not decline. What unsettled him was what followed afterward, when control shifted to strangers with cameras and agendas. He had watched it happen too many times. A famous death became a public contest. Who arrived? Who cried? Who stood closest to the family? The story bent itself around the most visible figure, not the one in the casket. Dean understood the mechanics of that distortion better than anyone. He had lived inside it for decades. So he spoke carefully, choosing structure over sentiment. He didn't mention funerals at first. He talked about memory, how it reshapes people without permission, how presence can overpower intention. He acknowledged something Frank had rarely heard said aloud, that Frank Sinatra was larger than any room he entered, larger even than grief. Wherever Frank stood, gravity shifted. Dean wasn't resentful of that. He was realistic. The request emerged not as a plea, but as a conclusion. If Frank appeared at the service, the day would no longer belong to the man being buried. It would become a referendum on their history, their conflicts, their reconciliation, or lack thereof. The cameras would decide the narrative before the ground was even closed. Dean had no interest in that version of goodbye. What he wanted instead was quiet, a ceremony that ended where it began. No second act, no reframing. He wanted to leave without one last performance forced upon him by association. He made it clear this was not punishment, not a test, not leverage. It was trust, placed heavily, deliberately, on the one person capable of undoing everything by simply showing up. The logic was ruthless and elegant. If Frank attended, the world would remember the spectacle of his presence. If he stayed away, the absence would raise questions, but no answers. Silence would remain intact. The focus would never settle comfortably, and that discomfort would protect the truth better than any statement ever could. Dean asked for no explanation afterward. No defense, no whispered clarifications to mutual friends. The request only worked if it remained unspoken. Once explained, it collapsed into sentimentality. Frank understood that immediately. He didn't like it. He argued against it. But he understood. This wasn't about ego. It was about authorship. Dean had spent his life allowing others to narrate him, sometimes inaccurately, sometimes unfairly. This was the one chapter he refused to surrender. By removing the most powerful symbol from the room, he ensured the ending would resist simplification. What he asked for was restraint in its purest form. And when Frank eventually complied, he did so knowing the cost. He would be judged, misunderstood, accused of coldness by people who had never been asked to choose between grief and respect. Dean anticipated that too. That was why he never asked for agreement, only for execution. The silence did not end with the service. It spread. In the days that followed, speculation arrived on schedule. Columns were written. Conversations lowered their voices and sharpened their guesses. Old footage resurfaced, spliced together with new theories. The story tried to assemble itself around the question everyone pretended not to ask. Why one absence outweighed every presence in the room? There were easy answers available. Pride, old wounds, a friendship that had finally collapsed under its own mythology. None of them held for long, but they circulated anyway, because noise dislikes a vacuum. Frank Sinatra never responded. Not in interviews, not through friends, not even in the small private settings where candor was usually exchanged. He let the assumptions settle where they landed. To explain would have been to violate the one condition that mattered. What surprised people later was how many others followed that lead. Those who had been closest to Métis. Dean Martin did not rush to correct the narrative. They didn't defend Frank, but they didn't accuse him either. When pressed, they changed the subject. When cornered, they offered nothing more than a measured pause. It wasn't coordinated. It was instinctive. Some understandings don't need rehearsal. Years passed. The headlines faded. New legends replaced old ones. Yet the unanswered question lingered, resurfacing now and then in documentaries or late-night conversations between people who remembered how things actually felt, not how they were recorded. Frank aged visibly after that, though no one connected the change to a single day. He continued performing, continued living inside public admiration. But there were moments, brief, almost invisible, when something hardened behind his eyes, as if he were guarding a line he had sworn never to cross. He never spoke Dean's name in this context, never reframed the story to his advantage. Silence, once accepted, became permanent. Much later, long after urgency had expired, someone from the narrowest circle, someone with nothing left to protect, offered a single sentence, not meant for publication, and never attributed. He was the only one who did exactly what was asked. That was all. No praise followed, no elaboration. The sentence carried weight precisely because it refused to explain itself. It wasn't about loyalty or sacrifice in the dramatic sense. It was about discipline, the kind that leaves no visible trace. In the end, the absence achieved what presence never could. The funeral was remembered not for who stood at the front, but for who did not. The day remained contained, resistant to ownership. No image ever replaced the closed casket. No narrative settled comfortably around it. Dean had anticipated that outcome. He understood that legends demand participation, but truth sometimes requires withdrawal. He also knew, with unnerving certainty, which man would respect that distinction even when it cost him reputation. The story does not close with resolution. It closes with restraint. Because the point was never why Frank stayed away. The point was that Dean knew, without asking twice, that he would.